Hey there, this is Cindy Fessmeyer with the Department of Public Instruction. Thanks for being on our webinar today, Being Still in an Emergency with Beck Tench. I'll tell you about Beck in just a moment and then she'll get started. But in the meantime, wanted to let you know that there is a window called Q&A, and that's where you can share thoughts or questions along the way. We have a couple folks monitoring that, and they can ask questions that you have along the way. They'll be holding them until the end of the webinar, and then Beck will have a conversation with us based on what you're interested in. I want to begin by introducing Beck to you. Beck is currently involved with the Wisconsin Libraries Transforming Communities community engagement training effort here in the state. And I'm very pleased to introduce her to the rest of the state as well, even the folks not involved in that cohort. Beck is a wife, daughter, friend, teacher, gardener, cyclist, kind stranger, and PhD student at the University of Washington Information School. She has deep and abiding curiosities about contemplative practice, technology, and public space, and all of that will be apparent in what you hear from her today. Specifically, she's interested in how public space and technology can be designed to facilitate contemplative experience and also perhaps cultivate and sustain regular contemplative practice. Through her work, she hopes to help herself and others develop skills and a greater capacity for assessing personal wisdom, connecting with others through compassion and friendship, improving the quality of their lives through awareness of life as we're living it, and mitigating or minimizing the harms of attention-driven digital culture. That's a mouthful, but Beck will walk us through it. It is my honor to hand it over to Beck.
Thank you, Cindy. And hello, everyone. I'm happy to be talking with you today. I'm also a bit hesitant or maybe want to share a disclaimer that while I study contemplative practice and attention restoration and technology and all the things that Cindy just told you about, I don't feel in any way qualified to talk about life in a pandemic. I do feel like my studies are helping me become more and more qualified to talk about stillness. And so today, I just want to take a leap and say, what would it look like to be still right now in a pandemic? What might we learn from that? And just kind of share some provisional ideas about what I think that might mean. So that's what the plan is for today. So I call this talk Stillness in an Emergency, and I want to kind of define those two terms, emergency and stillness. So let's start with emergency. These are things that we already know, I realize, but if we look at Webster, the dictionary says that emergencies are serious, unexpected, often dangerous situations that require immediate action. That's our common understanding of what emergency means. But if we look at the origins of the word, it actually has another meaning, and that is to bring to light. In other words, emergence. So if we think about what it might mean to be still, not running around, not still because we should be running around in response to emergency, but rather still because we're paying careful attention to what might be coming to light. That's the thought experiment that drives what this talk is going to be about. So here's how I want the time to go. First, I want to talk about stillness, what it is, how others have described it, and then talk about how we can practice being still, especially at a time like now. But then talk about why that's going to be very hard to do, especially at a time like now. And then, like I promised, suggest some provisional ideas about why being still right now in this pandemic might bring some things to light. So let's talk about this word stillness first. So I have a special way of relating to the word stillness. And in short, what I define stillness as the space between stimulus and response. What do I mean by that? I mean stimulus in the sense of life happening to us, full of stimuli, and what we do in reaction to life happening to us. That's our response. So if we look at our life, these two things are generally just right next to each other. We touch a hot pan, we let go. A driver cuts us off, maybe we honk our horn or seethe internally. But we have these two moments that are right next to each other. And I'm also going to just say that someone's microphone's causing some static right now. So we have these moments right next to each other in our typical experience of life. Stimulus, response, stimulus, response, stimulus, response. But if we zoom into that moment that's smashed right next to each other, and we keep zooming in, there's actually a space between those two things. Viktor Frankl is credited with the quote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." In other words,
Hey, Beck, it's Cindy here. You are muted. Can you please unmute yourself? I mistakenly muted everyone, including you, unfortunately. Oh, sorry about this, folks. We'll get started in just a minute. Thank you. Sorry, Beck.
Where did you leave? Where did I leave off?
Viktor Frankl.
Okay. Did I say the quote?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So I'm going to say it just to remind us, since that was a bit. So between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response, and in our response lies our growth and our freedom. In other words, no matter what we call it, we could call it stillness, we could call it presence, mindfulness, contemplation, awareness, even transcendence. We can put things in between stimulus and response, and that is how we use stillness at a time like now, or at a time like any other. In other words, we can put compassion in between stillness and response, stimulus and response, or we could put patience, or we could put courage, and we can stretch that space by practicing stillness. So let's talk about a very common thing that we all experience and what it would mean to look at that experience through this lens of stimulus and response and stillness. So let's say that we are all, I don't know how many people are on this call, but let's just say we're all in a big room sitting in a circle. And I were to ask you, okay, we're going to go around the room and everybody's going to say their name and something that you're feeling right now, something that's a little bit scary to share with everyone. I don't know what your experience of that prompt would be, but my experience would be that I would start to immediately imagine what I was going to say, and I would be thinking about that while the people before me were going. And then when it was my turn to speak, like I'm speaking right now, I might actually just fly out of my head and not even really know what I'm doing and just say whatever it was I thought I was going to say. And then once it wasn't my turn anymore, I would remember what I said, relive it, judge it, and I would be missing most of what was going on in my body, in my mind, and in the room. So in circles like that, because there's a little bit of performance, it's so silly, it's just saying our name, but because there's some performance, it's actually this great way to see how we have stimulus and response just butting up right next to each other. If we were to go around that circle putting space in between those two things, we might listen to who's speaking when we aren't speaking. We might feel sensations, stress, anxiety, whatever inside our body. We might notice the other people in the circle and how they're being. There's all this stuff that we would pay attention to and choose our response based on had we approach a circle like that with stillness. We'll come back to the circle in a minute. Right now, I want to talk about what an expert says about what this stillness thing is. So this is Mary Froelich. She is a professor and a nun, and she has one of my favorite definitions of stillness, which she calls contemplative experience. I'm going to read this to you and then call out a few things about her definition. So Mary says, we can define contemplative experience as awareness, whether fleeting or habitual, of that most foundational, most original depth of being. Because this is our most foundational reality, contemplative experience is potentially available to every human being at all times and in every circumstance. It can and does happen to people without any preparation and while they're engaged in pursuits that are not concerned with seeking it. So when we look at stillness in this way, there are a few things I want to call out to this audience specifically. First, it can and does happen to people without any preparation. So we have all experienced moments of awe or grief or joy and just been completely available to that moment and not caught up in the future or not caught up in the past. That happens to all of us. Some of us, it happens to more regularly because we have practices, but all of us have experienced this thing happening to us. The other thing that she says is this experience is potentially available to every human being at all times in every circumstance. And I want to call this part out because I realize I'm talking to a bunch of library workers, and in that there can be, in my experience, a tendency towards perfectionism. And I don't want you to take away from this or anything I say today that you must now be perfectly still to life, but rather that any moment you decide to slow down and pay attention, there will be something there for you to pay attention to, that there will be an original depth to that moment that we can look at. And then the last thing that she said is that these moments can be fleeting, but they can also be habitual. And that's what I want to talk about next. How do we practice stillness as a habit? And I want to give a spoiler alert that the answer to how to be still is to practice. That is how we are still, is practicing being still. So let's talk about this practice. Let's go back to this circle that I mentioned before. We're all saying our name. And I want to talk about, imagine a scenario where instead of just the regular circle like I described it, instead I said, I want you to go around the circle and I want you to say your name. And I also want you to try to pay attention and not drift away in the moment. So just try to be completely available to whoever's speaking, including when you're speaking. And we would do that. Maybe it would take 20 minutes to get around the room. In that time, you would probably lose your focus and you would drift away from the present moment of whoever was speaking and get caught up in something. And in that drift is what I want to talk about next. So there's a book called Search Inside Yourself by Ming Tan, and he describes the experience of meditation and that experience of drift. And I want to read you a quote from Ming, and I want you to visualize what it's like to pay attention using the metaphor of a dumbbell and lifting weights with it. So Ming says, one important similarity between exercise and meditation is that in both cases, growth comes from overcoming resistance. For example, when you're weight training, every time you flex your bicep in resistance to the weight of the dumbbells, your bicep grows a little bit stronger. The same process happens during meditation. Every time your attention wanders away from your breath and you bring it back, it is like flexing your biceps. Your muscle of attention grows a bit stronger. So in that circle, if we're here, we're at the place where we're paying attention. And then for whatever reason, we start to drift and we think like, what is it we're going to say when it's our turn? I mean, maybe I should be sincere and talk about something meaningful, or maybe I should be sarcastic, but would people realize that I was being sarcastic? Or maybe I should be witty or funny. what would be funny? And then we realize that we are at that point of being gone. We have no longer been paying attention. This moment is a precious moment. And I want for this talk to if there's anything you take away from it, it is actually this point, which is that when you realize you are gone, you're in exactly the place that you need to be, because that's the moment, like Ming says, that we need in order to get stronger. When we bring our attention back and overcome the resistance of being gone, we get stronger and we widen that space between stimulus and response. The drift is required in order to widen the space. So when you notice that you're gone, that's a precious opportunity to come back. That is the practice of stillness. But there are lots and lots of practices of stillness besides just saying your name in a circle. So I want to talk a little bit more about what are those specific practices, and also what are some that may be particularly good for right now. So this is a tool called the Tree of Contemplative Practice, and it's from the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society. And it has, it's the result of a study where they interviewed 70 or 80 professional contemplatives, monks, nuns, professors, people who lived rich contemplative lives, and they interviewed them, and then they came up with common themes about what their practices look like. And they visualized it on this tree. And what's important to notice about this tree is that there are lots of ways to be contemplative. It's not just sitting and counting your breath or praying. There are lots of ways that you can be contemplative. And also, any way that you can think to be contemplative, any way on this tree or things that aren't on this tree, they are connected by two roots. And those roots are connection and awareness. So when we're going around a circle, we can be still, we can be contemplative in this language by looking for awareness and connection while people are saying their names. Similarly, if we go on a run, if we just go on a run, it's exercise. But if we go on a run with the aim of connecting and being aware, then we're running contemplatively. So literally anything you do in your whole life that you do with connection and awareness is practicing stillness. But I want to talk a little bit about these branches and suggest some things that might be particularly good right now. So these branches have names that sometimes work for people and sometimes don't. Stillness, obviously, is one of those branches, and is the thing that we're kind of focusing on right now. And it has practices that look most like maybe mindfulness or something that you might see in magazines. But we also have a branch called generative, which is about the creative imagination and visualizing or beholding or having compassion for others. We have a creative branch, which is about contemplative arts and doing things that are actually creating things, writing words, painting pictures, doing that sort of thing. There's an activist branch, which is a tricky phrase, but it basically means work, as being still while we were working. And there are ways that we might do that work, like bearing witness or going on a vigil or a pilgrimage or volunteering, but basically working with connection and awareness at heart. And then there are ways that we can be still with others. And so there's a branch that's about being in relationship, a branch about moving our bodies, and a branch about treating the cycles or rituals of our lives with stillness and contemplation. So this is a wonderful tool. If we go to the website, which is contemplativemind.org, and look at this, you can click on all these different leaves off of the branches and see more about those activities. So that's one way to just get some different kinds of practices. Another way is to look at arenas in which you can be still, where it's just a place of where stillness is more likely to happen. So these arenas come from a former Trappist monk and a psychologist named James Finley. And he articulated 8 different environments that tend to afford presence and stillness. So for example, going out into nature, or being in a very intimate conversation with another human, or being completely by yourself, or being in the presence of art or meditating. Finley also talks about how when we experience pain and suffering, we're actually often quite present to that. So if you can imagine, when I mentioned the hot pan before, touching the hot pan, you're actually right there present in that moment when that happens. Also, when we are noticing that we are healing, or in moments of reflection. So you can put yourself in these arenas to be more likely to be in a space where stillness is afforded to you. And then this last tool that I want to talk about is called the Space Deck. It's a website, thespacedeck.com. And it is about 56 different activities. The activities span the tree of contemplative practice. That was the root of the card deck that was created. And each of these activities were created by and for librarians and museum professionals. And so you can go to this site and find different activities that these individuals, there's over 100 librarians and museum professionals that created this deck. You can see the different ideas they had for cultivating space in life and work, and this cultivating space also cultivates stillness in the way that we're talking about it today. So at a time like now, you may want to look at some of these practices and look for in particular practices that allow you to cultivate gratitude or allow you to connect with other humans. Those two things might be, in particular, a great way to approach practicing stillness specific to this pandemic time. But there's another way that we can practice stillness, and it doesn't involve looking at frameworks or card decks or trees of contemplative practice, and that is we can create our own practices as well. And sometimes, and I personally believe that the practices that we create might be actually the most potent practices for us. They kind of have the lessons that we most need in the moment. So I want to tell you an example of one of those practices that I've had. For the last 5 years, I have noticed hearts everywhere I go, just the shape of a heart. This was the very first heart that I noticed, and it was outside of the apartment I was living at the time, and it was just on the sidewalk after it rained one day. And I don't know why, but I decided to take a picture of it and start noticing hearts as just a practice everywhere I went. And so over time, I noticed hearts everywhere, and patch of dirt or a cloud or a hazelnut shell or graffiti. I literally, everywhere I go, notice hearts. And this is great because it always gives me something to come back to. If we think about that circle and drifting, it gives me a reason to see that I'm not noticing hearts and come back to it. So I'm constantly strengthening that try again muscle. And I also want to share a little bit about what this practice has taught me, which is that when I first started doing it, I thought that every heart I saw was sort of like a signpost telling me that I was kind of like in the right place, on the right path, something that I belonged in this new city. But after about 4 years, I came to a heart and I realized in this moment of clarity, this thing that Froelich would say happens to us, I realized that everywhere I am is the right place. And it was the lesson that I needed from this practice. So I have assigned this practice to my students in a class I teach about design. And I want to share with you what one student said about what happened from cultivating this practice, and specifically because I think it makes a couple of really good points. So this student didn't pick hearts. I allow students to pick whatever they want to pick to notice. This student picked stars, and this is what they said. What started out as me keeping my eyes open for stars turned into me paying more attention to my environment and surroundings and really seeing everything I passed by. I notice things now, not just stars. I notice small tattoos and spelling errors and dust on dumbbells. I am so much more aware of everything around me. My noticing of stars turned into noticing my surroundings, turned into so much more. I began noticing things about myself. I started really appreciating I started really noticing moments of gratitude. And not only that, I take time to reflect on them and appreciate what I'm grateful for. I truly think I am more appreciative of even the small things because I have learned to slow down and be aware of not only what is going on around me, but also what is going on with myself. I think this has been so important for me, and I want to continue to live life with my eyes wide open, reflecting and appreciating my moments of happiness. With this being said, I think I can grow to be able to notice moments that aren't so great. There is also value in taking the time to appreciate times where I may not be as happy or grateful. So there are two things that I want to point out about this student's reflection. The first is that what started out as stars turned into other things like dust on dumbbells, and that is the power of cultivating stillness. When we start to be still in a comeback circle, or as we're walking around looking for a shape, or as we count our breaths in the morning meditation, or whatever it is that you might pick to cultivate stillness, when we start to do that, those moments stretch between stimulus and response in other areas of our lives. And the second thing the student said, which is that when we start to notice other things in our lives, we might notice things that aren't so great. So it's very important to realize that practicing stillness, coming back when we've drifted, is something that stretches into things that we aren't intending and can show us things that are really hard. And I want to talk about that next. So when I think about why being still is hard, I think of it in two ways. The first is why being still is hard from an internal perspective, like the student was talking about. And the second is why being still is hard from an external perspective, why the world is distracting. So let's talk about the external perspective first. So I'm not sure if you've heard this phrase before, but we live in an attention economy. That basically means that corporations have been incentivized financially to harvest, commoditize, and trade human attention. And that's why advertisements and all the sorts of things that we kind of already we suspect, I had a conversation or I bought this thing and I'm seeing ads about it. That's all evidence of an attention economy. But there's a lot of evidence that is harder to notice as well. We're going to talk about that. So here's an example of how an attention economy can play out in a very mundane way, and it happened to me last night. So I was preparing this talk, and I was talking about the student's reflection, and I was transitioning into why being still is hard, and I had this moment where I got overwhelmed. And so I exited out of my writing app that I was using, and I opened Twitter. And so I looked at Twitter. I scrolled down a little bit and I saw a tweet from somebody who I don't know. I do know of this person, but I don't know them. But somebody I know well had liked this person and what they said. And so I clicked on that, and I saw on that person's stream a link to an Atlantic article. This person's a bit famous. Clicked a link to an Atlantic article, went to the Atlantic article. There was an embedded video of this person singing a song. I clicked that, I watched the song. At the end of the video, there was a smattering of other videos I could watch. One of them had this person looking kind of goofy in the freeze frame, and I thought that was interesting, so I clicked on that. That happened to be a John Prine tribute. And so then I ended up Googling John Prine and on the Wikipedia page. And then I went into the Google image search. And here I am, I don't know how much later, watching John Prine and Bonnie Raitt sing a song at some concert. Then I realized I had drifted, and I came back to what I was trying to do. And I want to share that if this experience ever happens to you as well, it's no accident. The fact of the matter is that technology since the 1990s has been designed increasingly by something called behavior design. It was originally called captology, then it was called persuasive design, and now it's called behavior design. And it is based on something you've probably heard before, which is B.F. Skinner and his boxes. B.F. Skinner was the scientist who discovered that when you put an animal in a box and you had a lever in the box and they pressed the lever for food, they would eat when they were hungry. But if you only sometimes gave them food, so they press the lever, sometimes they get food, sometimes they wouldn't, they would become addicted to pressing the lever. So in this example of John Prine, I have been conditioned to go to Twitter when I'm overwhelmed. And when I'm in Twitter, the environment, the endless scroll, the clickbait, the recommended videos, all of that stuff is expressly designed to keep me there. And it works really well, even for people like myself who try very hard to minimize that. So basically, what used to be Skinner boxes are our phones, and we have these buttons on our phones that we press for intermittent, variable, informational rewards. This sort of thing that happened to me last night is kind of an obvious example. We can kind of chart what happened, but it's not always obvious. So for example, Instagram has been revealed to basically withhold information from you to give you larger doses of dopamine, which is what happens when we get that informational reward later on. So for example, if I post a picture on Instagram and I look 10 minutes later and it shows I have 2 likes, the reality might be that I have 10, but they only show me 2. And then a few minutes later, they might burst 8 more likes in order to give me a higher dose of dopamine and condition my attention to continue to return to Instagram. Those sorts of things are one of the reasons why it's very hard to be still in the world right now, and especially in the world right now, because most of our interactions are mediated, and our important stuff, our work, our connections with friends and family, how we teach our children, all that stuff is mediated on devices that have great stuff in them, but also have been designed expressly to harvest our attention. So it's very hard for us to be still in a moment. So if we look at that example of what happened to me last night, the moment that triggered all of that is actually a great example of the other reason why it's hard to be still, which is that internal reason that we want to escape hard feelings, not pay attention to them. What would I have learned about myself had I stuck with and been still and not done the quick stimulus response escape into Twitter of that moment of overwhelm? What would I have been able to put in the space between had I been still in that moment of overwhelm instead of gone to Twitter? I think that our society doesn't help us very well with feeling fear or anger or sadness. And in that moment, I was probably feeling fear. So we don't really know what to do with those emotions. And so we escape to entertainment or to other kinds of things, and frequently nowadays to technology, so that we don't have to feel them. Thomas Merton, who's a Trappist monk, actually mentor of James Finley, who I mentioned before, has a beautiful quote to describe what it means to be still and why it's hard. And again, Thomas Merton uses the word contemplation instead of stillness. He says, "Let no one hope to find in contemplation an escape from conflict, from anguish, or from doubt. On the contrary, the deep, inexpressible certitude of the contemplative experience awakens a tragic anguish and opens many questions in the depths of the heart, like wounds that cannot stop bleeding." So I want us to consider that what Merton is telling us here is that when we slow down and truly are still to life, we have some really yucky stuff that can come up. And I think this is very important to know, because the messages we get about mindfulness and all these sorts of things that are very popular these days, they don't talk about the reality that to slow down, like my student said, means to experience moments that aren't so great. And right now, I guarantee you, if we slow down because of the amount of fear and frustration that we're all experiencing in our lives, we're going to experience some of that tragic anguish. And I think it's important to know that if you have had any sort of trauma in your past or in your present, that these practices on the tree and in the space deck and all that stuff, they can actually open you up to that stuff. And it's kind of the frustrating thing about stillness in our culture that hasn't taught us how to be good at this stuff is that we don't have communities and teachers that we practice this together. We do it by ourselves. And so when those traumas get reactivated, we're alone in that. So I want to say that, like, if you go forward from this talk and you try to widen that space between stimulus and response, and you try to be still to the circle while people are going around it, or you try a new practice like yoga every morning, or whatever you do, journaling, some hard stuff will come up, and some really, really hard stuff might come up if you have traumas in your past. And I think you should know that and be prepared and cautious about it. So this brings us to sort of an inflection point. We've had this sort of new grounding in this word emergency to bring to light. We have this sort of richer understanding of what I mean when I say stillness, the stretching of what happens to us and how we react, and putting inside of that something intentional like compassion for ourselves or others, courage, grace. We have all kinds of resources, the tree, the deck, the arenas, noticing practice. And we have this knowledge that it's coming back. It's the practice of these things that actually widens the space. We have to go away in order to strengthen the ability to come back. And then we have this most recent realization that there are some really, really good reasons why this is hard, both from an external culture point of view and from an internal escapist point of view. With all of this at mind, I want to talk now about what might we notice or know if we approached COVID-19 with stillness. What sorts of things would it bring to light? I have 3 provisional thoughts. So the first thought is that COVID-19 is shining a big bright light on the fact that life is always uncertain. It is always uncertain. We have as much control over our lives as we ever did. It just doesn't feel like it. And we now know, faced with unprecedented and new normals, that life is out of our control. We are fragile and interdependent, and it's an uncertain time. It's always been the case, but COVID-19 is shining a big bright light on that. Another thing that COVID-19 is shining a big bright light on is that life is always emerging. In that original sense of the word emergency, every moment of life is deserving of prompt and immediate attention. Not that we have to be promptly and immediately attentive, but that every moment has that in it. Thich Nhat Hanh has this beautiful instruction of how to give a hug that I think highlights what these first 2 points, that life is always uncertain and life is always emerging, really mean. So I'm going to read to you what Thich Nhat Hanh's hugging practice is about. He says, hugging is a deep practice. You need to be totally present to do it correctly. When I drink a glass of water, I invest 100% of myself in drinking it. You can train yourself to live every moment of your daily life like that. Before hugging, stand facing each other as you follow your breathing and establish your true presence. Then open your arms and hug your loved one. During the first in-breath and out-breath, become aware that you and your beloved are both alive. With the second breath, think of where you both will be 300 years from now. And with the third breath, be aware of how precious it is that you are both still alive. When you hug this way, the other person becomes real and alive. You don't need to wait until one of you is ready to depart for a trip. You may hug right now and receive the warmth and stability of your friend in the present moment. Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us that we are alive, still and in the first place. In 300 years, we won't be here. COVID-19 is telling us that for some of us, that period of time is even shorter. And it's precious that we are here now. The third thing that I want to suggest that COVID-19 is bringing to light is something that's actually standing in the way of what COVID-19 is bringing into light. And that is the technologies that we escape and use block these realizations that life is uncertain and life is emergent, and stillness is a wonderful response to those two things. In his book, Stand Out of Our Light, Freedom and Resistance in the Attention Economy, the author James Williams talks about what we actually pay when we pay attention. And I want to read that to you now. He writes, "What do you pay when you pay attention? You pay with all the things you could have attended to but didn't, all the goals you didn't pursue, all the actions you didn't take, and all the possible yous you could have been had you attended to those other things. Attention is paid in possible futures foregone. You pay for that extra Game of Thrones episode with the heart-to-heart you could have had with your anxious child. You pay for that extra hour of social media with the sleep you didn't get and fresh feeling you didn't have the next morning. You pay for giving into that outrage-inducing piece of clickbait about that politician you hate with the patience and empathy it took from you, and the anger you have at yourself for allowing yourself to take the bait in the first place." Williams argues that being distracted not only affects our behavior right now, what we're doing, but it also affects our goals and values, who we are, and our capacity for reflection and self-awareness that defines those values in the first place, how we know the world, how we know ourselves. So when we think about my John Prine rabbit hole, there are things that I could have done and could have been that I wasn't because I went in that rabbit hole. And that rabbit hole happens to me a lot. COVID-19 is showing us that technology can prevent us from attending to the days and hours of our lives. And these are important. And Annie Dillard has the best words I've ever seen for this when she writes, "How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. What we are doing with this hour or that one is what we are doing." We're living our lives right this very second watching this webinar. We're living it in the middle of a pandemic. This hour, that hour, every hour we're alive, we're living our lives. What we're doing is our lives. As Mary Froelich tells us, each one of those moments has original depth of meaning if we want to attend to it. But with all of that said, the thing that I think is most likely to have any resonance of all, and I've already hinted at this several times, is that everything I just said, you're going to forget, and I forget. All of these moments of awareness, the stimulus and response, the stretching of the space, all of it, we forget and get caught up in just living our lives. We get caught up because we get distracted by whatever, and we drift. And so I also want you to remember one last thing, and that is in the moments of darkness where we are gone, there is always a precious and ever-present opportunity to come back. And coming back, we strengthen that muscle of trying again. That muscle of trying again is what will stretch that space. It will allow us to put our intentions into our actions. And that's the point. It's not to be still in an emergency, but rather to come back when we realize we've got caught up in our future or past imaginings of what the emergency will bring. So with that, I am going to thank you, put a little gratitude in the space between my stimulus and response. and I'm going to try to find my way to Microsoft Teams so that I can see if there are any questions. Thank you.
Hey, Beck, why don't you can just hang out where you are and keep that screen up, and
Okay.
I'll read out questions for you, I think.
Okay, that sounds good.
Thanks. Or comments too, if anyone wants to say anything.
Yeah, and if there is a lack of questions, which is generally the case for my talks, what I would like to ask the group is to help me understand what are some practices that you already have and that you're bringing to your life right now that are giving you some sanity and some stillness.
Nice. I'll put that question into the chat.
One thing that some people tend to ask is if they can get a list of the sources for some of the quotes that I read, and I am happy to send that along to Cindy, or maybe we could put them in the YouTube comments when this gets published.
Perfect. Thanks. So yeah, we had somebody ask if there are any suggestions on readings, and it sounds like that's going to be in the follow-up. Beck just talked about that. The recording will be available afterwards, and it will include the slides. Beck, people are saying excellent stuff here. Thank you.
So I would like to reflect a bit on the reading.
Okay.
So yes, there are the things that I mentioned in this talk, which are all great readings that I recommend to one degree or the other, some of which I really, really recommend. But I think that I also think, so there's a practice on the Tree of Contemplative Practice called Lectio Divina, which is a Catholic practice of reading scripture very, 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 very slowly. And it has been secularized, and you could basically read anything very, very slowly. And I have practiced this reading academic text slowly and poetry and all sorts of things. And so I think that one interesting way to think about stillness and reading, definitely can recommend some great books about these sorts of things, but I think it'd be great if you went to your own bookshelf and you just looked at what was on the shelf, and whatever kind of leapt out to your attention, just pick it up and thumb through it. And there are a few things that you can do, but basically try to cultivate a space for reading. Turn your phone to silent or turn it off. Tell the people in your house, if you're living with other people, that you want some time alone, and just basically don't read to know, but read to read. Just read for the experience of reading. And one thing that you can also do in that experience is set a bell of mindfulness, like every 3 minutes, to just check in with what's happening in your head, what's happening with your emotions, and what's happening in your body while you're reading at that ding of the bell. So you could have a little alert come on your phone, or set a timer so that you just check in with yourself and see where those 3 things are in that moment. Have you drifted, or were you right there with the text? So I think that reading is a wonderful practice of stillness as well, and to have that intuitive, actually just read what you want to read right now instead of what you're supposed to read or what's really super compelling because it's, the news or whatever, is a wonderful practice too.
That's really good to hear, because of course most people think that that's all librarians do all day is read a book. So yay, we're on the right path. I'm going to read some of the experiences that people are sharing in the chat. So I'll just read a few and then pause, and you can speak if you'd like, Beck. I do yoga meditation, helps a lot these times. Sandy says, I'm doing a gratitude journal. I write down 3 things I'm grateful for before I send out my first email of the day. Awesome.
That's great.
I listen to half an hour of an audiobook before I go to sleep. It helps to relax me. I ride my bike most days. Such freedom. Let's see.
So I want to pause for a second and talk about this gratitude practice,
Cool.
which I think is just so wonderful. And I especially love that it's cultivated right before your interaction with communicating over an email. So like great practice. And I think one of the things that can happen with gratitude practices that are done really regularly is that they can feel, they can tend to feel kind of rote or uninspired, you know, like the first little while that you're practicing, you might kind of get into a zone of really thinking of things that you might not have thought of, but then you just sort of feel like you always are grateful for this thing or that thing. And so one interesting way to play with the gratitude practice after some time is to shrink the gratitude in a way and basically find the smallest thing that you can think of to be grateful for. So you look at something and you say, I'm grateful for you know, this computer that works well or something, you know, and you just make it smaller and smaller and smaller until you get to just the barest, littlest thing that you can find to be grateful for. It's a fun way to play with gratitude, and also in some kind of weird chemistry or physics, maybe would be the better metaphor, the smaller you can think of, the smallest thing you can think of makes your gratitude bigger and bigger and bigger.
Very cool. I'll read a couple more comments of people's practices. Thank you so much. I have been a meditator of many sorts, stillness, activism, walking, etc. for many years. And one of the best things I realized was that the wandering and coming back was the biggest gift. So reinforcing exactly what you said. Lots and lots of kudos to you, Beck. I'm just going to read this one because it's lovely. Thank you, Beck. I think we're all resting in the stillness you created for us. Hear, hear. Somebody mentions free apps like Insight Timer that help with guided meditation that they'll use to help themselves slow down.
Yep. So I want to pause there and say 2 things, one about meditation and the other about Insight Timer, and kind of the third about the umbrella of apps for meditation. So I think that first, what's it called? Insight Timer. Insight Timer is the app that I use to get that little bell of mindfulness when I'm reading, that 3-minute bell. It has a mode, has really nice bell sounds, which is important to me, and it has a mode where you can basically say, ping me every 3 minutes forever, and that way, however long I'm reading, I know that I'll get that 3-minute bell. And I feel like it's from an organization that feels a little bit more reputable than some of the others in the meditation app world. I've studied a lot about meditation apps, both commercial and kind of research oriented. And I just want to kind of give a bit of a perspective that I see meditation apps. It's related exactly to what I just said in this talk, which is the importance of the drift and the importance of building the muscle that comes back. And so many of these meditation apps, first off, they use principles of behavior design to condition us to meditate, which you would think would be a good thing. But I'm not so sure. And maybe I'll change my mind on this one day, but for today, I have a concern that habituating us to meditating isn't strengthening our intention muscle, the muscle that we would need to actually build to meditate. So I think that meditation apps are very successful, and I think that some kind of have a little bit more integrity than others. But I also think that we need to look at them for what aren't we strengthening by offloading some of our motivation to this external source. So anyway, time will tell how I really feel about that, but that's where I'm at right now with meditation apps. Not saying don't use them, I'm just saying let's use them with care.
Okay, we have just a few minutes left, but a couple of kind of comments that go together. Each one's a little bit long, so I'll read first Cheryl's and then Shannon's. Cheryl says, at work, I often feel like the stillness that I need to answer a question or provide data produces a void that others fill up with their quick questions, which may not always be the best answers, but which are accepted because they're the first answers. How can I promote a culture of stillness at work so that we can all have the room to be thoughtful in our responses? So that's one. The second one that is somewhat related is from Shannon. Shannon writes, I'm surprised by the emotional reaction I've had having this talk. I find myself having a fear reaction to producing work a lot lately and leaving Word documents and my work to flee to my phone fairly often. A lot of opportunity to flex the comeback muscle. I wonder how to practice stillness before a response in a time where it feels like more immediate reactions are expected more than ever. Lots of talk about innovation and pivoting to respond to community needs. And I think we'll leave it there then. Thanks all for your comments.
So but I get to respond, right?
You sure do.
Okay, great. What hard questions have this been posed? So I think that the first answer I say to both questions is that in both scenarios, you have the ample opportunity to notice. So when you are in a situation that is unideal and you notice that, that is now what you're working with. So the fact that, you know, life is uncertain and we're not in control is also true in our institutions. And the interactions that we have with others the void gets filled. There are things that happen that we don't have control in those situations as well. That's the moment of noticing we work with and we're still to, and we invite what's happening inside of us in this moment. So that's first I want to say available in these two scenarios. The other is that what you're pointing out, and it's not an easy thing, is that our culture does not support us in this work. If we think about in other parts of the world, or in parts of our history where, for example, we had regular Sabbath practices and everybody was at the same day of the week or 1 of 2 days of the weekend checking out, not working, then the whole world slowed to that. And it was a lot easier to do. So if everyone at your institution is trying to be still, then those moments of void will be there. And the reality is that our organizations don't operate that way. And so I think that there are some ideas we could have, like let's just say at the beginning of a meeting, you know, during this meeting, I'd like to just respect silence in between when people talk, and let's all just try to not fill it for this meeting and see what happens. It's going to be awkward. Some people might not like it, some people might, but it would be worth experimenting. So I guess that would be my suggestion for the first question, is to treat your institutional culture as a place of experimentation, and where that fails, as strengthening something noticing within you. For the other question, I think that we're all in that place. So you're not alone, at least. I think that the fact that you're connected to your emotions in this talk is a really good sign about what you have capacity to do. That's not available to all of us right now. It's not easy for all of us to actually feel emotions. This really, really scary time. So first off, there's that. And secondly, you're not alone in suspecting that innovation and speed is what's required right now. A good friend of mine, Nina Simon, has an organization called Of By For All. It's ofbyforall.org. And she recently blogged about, let's be slow right now, map our assets, try to figure out where we might intervene, but not exactly act just yet. So there are people thinking about this in the way that you're thinking about it, and it's good. So anyway, those are my two reactions to that. Wonderful questions and also beautiful examples of practice. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. I'm going to stop with just one end with one comment in the chat that got a couple of likes, and it's a really lovely way to wrap up. So Amy says, every morning I have an orange juice moment. It is a sensory delight of taste, but I also look as distantly as my kitchen window allows me. The sugar wakes me up. I give thanks to the oranges that nourish me. So
Beautiful.
Thank you for sharing that, Amy.
Yeah,
thank you for being with us this afternoon, Beck. And for those of you who didn't see in the chat, the recorded webinar will be captioned and it will be available along with the slides and the reading list from Beck within a couple of days. It takes a few days for our caption service to catch up with everything. So thank you for logging on, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.